It began as a whisper in diplomatic circles, almost too strange to believe that one of the most secretive leaders in the world had just moved something immense out of sight, something that could shake the very balance of global power. Picture this: a massive cargo weighing 300 tons, loaded not onto an ordinary freighter, but onto a diplomatic vessel bound for China, shipped quietly, without fanfare, without public announcement. Rumors said it wasn't just cargo, it was a strategic gamble, a move so bold that even the United States government classified it as a strategic crisis. What was in those crates? Why did it matter so much? And how did it pull two of the world's biggest powers into a sudden clash of wills and interests that had everyone asking, is this the start of something far bigger? For years, Nicolas Maduro, the controversial president of Venezuela, had been at odds with the United States, his leadership dismissed by Washington as illegitimate, his government accused of corruption, economic collapse, and deep ties with rival powers. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, roughly 300 billion barrels, a prize coveted by nations and corporations alike. It sits atop energy wealth that could fuel economies for decades. And yet, for years under Maduro's rule, that wealth barely trickled out to benefit the Venezuelan people, but what few outside closed. Diplomatic doors knew until recently was that Maduro and his inner circle were quietly deepening ties with Beijing in ways that went beyond oil, sales, and traditional diplomacy. This wasn't the usual barrel for cash arrangement. This was something much heavier, much more secret to 300 tons of assets quietly packed, sealed, and sent to China under diplomatic cover. What was in those shipments? Gold, machinery, something else entirely. And how did the United States find out? To understand why this matters, imagine the stakes. Venezuela's oil, its minerals, its economic potential, these are not just commodities. They are geopolitical levers, tools with which nations can exert influence far beyond South America. China, which has been Venezuela's largest trading partner for years, buying vast amounts of crude and financing major state projects, had invested heavily in Caracas's future. But that relationship hasn't been without tension. China's appetite for Venezuelan resources grew against a backdrop of economic collapse at home, and Chávez's successor, Maduro, embraced Beijing not just as a buyer, but as an anchor, a guarantee, he hoped, against pressure from Washington. And then came the tipping point. When Washington launched a dramatic military operation in early January 2026 capturing Maduro himself in the Venezuelan capital, it was greeted around the world as one of the most audacious moves by the U.S. in decades. American forces swooped in, took Maduro and his wife into custody, and flew them off to face charges. Suddenly, the United States was not just boycotting the Venezuelan government or imposing sanctions, it was physically removing a sitting president and asserting control over a nation's leadership. The U.S. framed the move on multiple fronts: a crackdown on narcotics trafficking, a blow against tyranny, and a necessary step to restore order. But behind those announcements was a much larger reality, a strategic showdown with China. The U.S. government publicly declared that it would not allow Beijing to gain a dominant foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and that Venezuela's energy, resources, and influence in Latin America could no longer be leveraged by rival powers. President Trump's administration made it clear, China and Russia are not welcome in the Americas now. Layer onto this the alleged 300-ton transfer thought by some international observers to be a shipment of extremely valuable assets, possibly gold or other materials that could secure China's economic stake in Venezuela in the face of American pressure. That kind of move doesn't just rattle markets, it challenges global power equations. It raises questions about trust, loyalty, and who really calls the shots in energy geopolitics. Every world leader and every spy in every capital suddenly wanted answers. Washington was furious, Beijing was cautious but defiant, and Maduro's loyalists were scrambling to protect their own interests. Ordinary Venezuelans, meanwhile, watched in disbelief as the drama unfolded, comically large headlines, rumors spinning through social media, and mounting economic fear on the streets of Caracas. Families struggled with shortages, businesses were uncertain of tomorrow, and the specter of international conflict felt uncomfortably close. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were waking up to headlines about oil markets, national security, and a distant nation whose turmoil suddenly seemed to matter deeply to their own future. So why did this 300-ton transfer trigger what the U.S. government labeled a strategic crisis? Think about it in simple terms. 300 tons is not a small shipment. It's the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds of something valuable. In a world where every ounce of gold, every draw of crude, and every diplomatic handshake is scrutinized for leverage, such a large, quiet transfer hints at something beyond routine trade. It suggests a desperate bid for security, a barter with high stakes, and possibly a hedge against encirclement by an increasingly aggressive United States. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that no one saw coming, at least not in this particular form. The U.S. wasn't just condemning Maduro's government anymore. It was moving on energy, on influence, on hemispheric policy. Chinese officials, blindsided but not inactive, began to speak out in international forums, accusing Washington of violating international norms and threatening global stability. Supporters of Maduro's administration, from Russia to Cuba to Iran, criticized the U.S. intervention and called for solidarity. But behind the words, each had their own interests, their own calculations, and their own fears about what might come next. This wasn't simply about an isolated shipment. It was about trust and betrayal in a world where alliances shift overnight, where resource flows can become flashpoints, and where silence and secrecy become weapons in their own right. People on the ground saw it as uncertainty. Will there be food? Will there be security? Will there be a future? People in Beijing saw it as a test, a moment to decide how hard they were willing to push in a world still dominated by U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. People in Washington saw it as a warning that old doctrines might have to be rewritten, that the Monroe Doctrine had resurfaced in a new, modern guise, and all the while, that 300-ton transfer sat at the heart of it. A quiet whisper turned explosive headline that raised more questions than answers. What exactly was moved? Why was it moved covertly? And how did its existence append foreign policy calculations from Caracas to Washington to Beijing? These questions weren't going away anytime soon. By now, you might be thinking one thing clearly: this story isn't just about Venezuela. It's not just about a transfer of goods or assets. It's about trust and fear, alliances and rivalries, and a global balance that's shifting faster than most of us realize. In the next chapter of this story, we'll peel back the layers, digging into what exactly was sent to China, why global powers reacted as they did, and how this moment could reshape the future of geopolitics. Because if there's one thing this crisis has shown, it's that in the modern world, every shipment can be a strategic chess move that redraws the board. The moment the news broke didn't land like a clear announcement. It landed like a shadow. Officials spoke carefully, journalists chose their words with caution, and analysts kept repeating the same phrase: too early to confirm. But behind that restraint, something else was happening. Phones were ringing late at night in Washington. Emergency meetings were being called in Beijing. And in Caracas, people who had survived years of shortages and uncertainty felt a new kind of fear settle in. The fear that their country had just become the center of a much larger game. To understand how it reached this point, you have to step back. Long before the rumors of a covert transfer, Venezuela had been quietly drifting away from the influence of the West. Sanctions tightened, diplomatic doors closed, oil revenue shrank. For Maduro, every option narrowed until China no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the only lifeline left. Beijing offered loans when others wouldn't. It offered infrastructure projects, oil for debt agreements, and something just as important: political cover. In return, China gained access, leverage, and long-term influence in a region the United States had long considered its strategic backyard, inside Venezuela's government. This shift wasn't debated publicly. It happened behind closed doors, in guarded rooms, where loyalty mattered more than transparency. Decisions were made by a small circle of people who believed they were defending the nation's sovereignty, even if it meant operating in silence. The people outside those rooms, factory workers, teachers, shop owners, only felt the consequences, never the reasons. And when whispers of a massive transfer began circulating, most Venezuelans had no idea whether it was true or just another rumor in a country already drowning in uncertainty. But intelligence agencies don't work on rumors. They look for patterns. Cargo schedules that don't make sense. Diplomatic flights that avoid normal routes. Shipping manifests that suddenly go dark. Somewhere along that chain, alarms were triggered. Something heavy had moved. Something valuable. And it had moved quickly, under protection that suggested urgency, maybe even panic. That's when phrase 300 tons began appearing in classified briefings. Repeated often enough to stick. For the United States, the concern wasn't just what was being transferred, but what it represented. If Venezuela was shifting a massive reserve of assets to China, it could mean insurance against sanctions, a bargaining chip for future negotiations, or a final attempt to lock in Chinese support before everything collapsed. In strategic terms, it looked like a country placing its last pieces on the board, knowing the clock was running out. And in Washington, that kind of move is never ignored. The response, however, was not immediate. It was calculated. Officials spoke of monitoring the situation while privately debating how far they were willing to go. The word crisis carries weight, and it isn't used lightly. Declaring a strategic crisis signals that something has crossed an invisible line, that normal tools may no longer be enough. But even then, nothing was resolved. The declaration raised more questions than answers, and the silence from Beijing only deepened the unease. China's reaction was measured, almost unreadable. Official statements emphasized respect for sovereignty and warned against external interference. There was no confirmation of receiving anything unusual, no denial either, just carefully chosen words, delivered calmly, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But behind that calm surface, Chinese planners were likely weighing their options. How much was Venezuela worth defending? How far could they push back without escalating the situation? And what exactly had just arrived on their doorstep? Back in Caracas, the atmosphere changed overnight. Government buildings tightened security. Longtime allies avoided eye contact. People who once spoke freely suddenly watched their words. For Maduro's inner circle, this was the moment everything they had been planning for years either paid off or fell apart. Some believed the transfer was a masterstroke, a way to secure support and survive the storm. Others feared it had only painted a larger target on their backs. Ordinary people felt the shift took, even if they couldn't explain it. Gas lines grew longer. Markets grew quieter. Parents whispered about whether schools would stay open. Taxi drivers talked about planes they saw at odd hours, flying low, flying fast. In a country where trust in official narratives had eroded long ago, imagination filled the gaps. And imagination, when fed by fear, can be powerful. Meanwhile, global markets reacted not with panic, but with caution. Oil prices flickered. Analysts debated scenarios on television panels. Was this about gold reserves, strategic minerals, sensitive technology? No one seemed sure, and that uncertainty itself became part of the story. Investors don't like what they can't see, and neither do governments. The lack of clarity made every possibility feel plausible, and every possibility carried consequences. What made this situation even more tense was timing. The alleged transfer happened at a moment when global alliances were already strained, when trust between major powers was thin. Every move was interpreted through the lens of rivalry. A shipment became a signal, a silence became a statement, and a single decision inside Venezuela echoed far beyond its borders. Some former officials began speaking anonymously, hinting at internal disagreements within the Venezuelan leadership. Not everyone supported the move, they said. Some warned it would provoke exactly the response that followed. Others believed there was no alternative left. These accounts were impossible to verify, but they added depth to the picture. A government under pressure, making choices with incomplete information, hoping for outcomes it could no longer fully control. As days passed, one detail kept resurfacing in quiet conversations. The speed. Whatever had been moved, it had been moved fast. Faster than normal trade, faster than routine diplomacy. Speed suggests urgency, and urgency suggests fear. Fear of seizure, fear of exposure, feared that time was running out. And that raised a chilling question. What would have happened if the transfer had been delayed, or stopped altogether? In Washington, some voices called for restraint, warning that escalation could push rivals closer together. Others argued the opposite, that allowing such moves to go unanswered would signal weakness. The debate wasn't just about Venezuela anymore. It was about setting precedent, about drawing lines in a world where power is increasingly contested. And once lines are drawn, crossing them becomes dangerous. China, for its part, remained patient. Patience has always been one of its strengths. Let others make the first move. Let tension build. Let uncertainty work in your favor. But patience doesn't mean passivity. Behind closed doors, calculations were being made, contingencies prepared, futures imagined. The arrival of a mysterious 300-ton shipment, real or alleged, had become a factor in those calculations, whether acknowledged publicly or not, and through it all, the central mystery remained untouched. No images, no documents, no confirmation, just wait, secrecy, and consequences. The kind of story that doesn't reveal itself all at once, but piece by piece, forcing everyone involved to react before they fully understand what they're reacting to. What was clear was this. The transfer, whatever its true nature, had changed the tone of everything. Conversations that once happened quietly were now happening under bright lights. Decisions that might have been postponed were suddenly urgent. And the people of Venezuela, caught between global powers and domestic uncertainty, were once again left waiting, watching forces far beyond their control shape their future. As the days stretched on, one question lingered in every capital, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If this was only the beginning, if this move was just the opening act, then what came next? Because in a world where 300 tons can shift alliances and spark a strategic crisis, the next move might not come in crates or cargo ships at all, and when it does, there may be no way to stop it. As the story continued to unfold, the sense of unease only deepened. The world had entered an uncomfortable pause, the kind where nothing explodes, nothing collapses outright, but everyone knows something is coming. Governments waited, markets hesitated, and behind every official statement, there was a second conversation happening in private, far away from cameras and microphones. Inside Washington, the situation split opinions in ways that weren't visible from the outside. Some officials viewed the alleged transfer as a calculated provocation, a message sent quietly but meant to be heard loudly. Others believed it was a defensive act, a regime trying to shield itself before the ground gave way beneath it. Intelligence briefings grew longer and more complex, filled with maps, timelines, and possibilities instead of clear conclusions. Every slide ended with the same words: assessment ongoing. At the heart of these discussions was a question that refused to go away. If Venezuela had indeed moved 300 tons of strategic assets to China, what did that say about its intentions? Was this about survival, or about shifting loyalty permanently? In global politics, intentions matter almost as much as actions. And right now, intentions were impossible to read. Meanwhile, Beijing faced its own quiet dilemma. China had invested billions in Venezuela over the years, not just in oil, but in infrastructure, loans, and political capital. Walking away would mean accepting losses and appearing weak. Standing firm could invite confrontation with the United States at a time when tensions were already high on multiple fronts. So China did what it often does in moments like this. It said very little, and watched everything. Chinese media coverage stayed calm, almost distant. Reports focused on stability, cooperation, and respect for international law. But analysts inside the country spoke more cautiously, hinting that Venezuela had become both an opportunity and a risk. If the shipment existed, it could strengthen China's long-term position, but it could also drag Beijing into a crisis it didn't fully control. And control, above all else, mattered. Back in Venezuela, the internal picture was far from unified. While the leadership projected confidence, cracks were beginning to show. Longtime insiders worried about leaks. Mid-level officials wondered if they would be blamed if things went wrong. Even within the military, loyalty was no longer something taken for granted. Some believed aligning so closely with China was the only path left. Others feared it would isolate the country even further and make it a pawn in a struggle between superpowers. On the streets, people felt the pressure in small, human ways. A shop owner noticed suppliers asking for payments sooner than usual. A hospital administrator heard rumors of funding delays. A student scrolling through social media saw conflicting headlines and didn't know which to trust. For them, geopolitics wasn't abstract. It showed up as anxiety, as uncertainty about tomorrow. One subplot, quietly gaining attention, was the role of intermediaries. Large transfers don't happen in isolation. They involve logistics companies, financial institutions, foreign ports, and paperwork that must pass through multiple hands. Somewhere along that chain, people knew more than they were saying. Some may have seen something unusual and chosen silence over exposure. Others may have passed fragments of information along, not knowing how big the story would become. Those fragments fed speculation. Was the transfer gold reserves meant to stabilize a future government in exile? Was it rare earth minerals, valuable in high-tech manufacturing? Was it something symbolic, meant to signal loyalty rather than economic value? Each theory regained supporters and critics, and none could be fully proven or dismissed. The mystery became self-sustaining, growing larger with every unanswered question. In Washington, policymakers worried not just about Venezuela, but about precedent. If a sanctioned government could quietly shift massive assets to a rival power, what stopped others from doing the same? What did that mean for the effectiveness of sanctions, for leverage, for influence? The strategic crisis wasn't just about one country, it was about a system showing signs of strain. The tension also played out in diplomatic language. Words were chosen carefully, sentences rewritten again and again before being released. Phrases like deep concern and serious implications appeared repeatedly, signaling alarm without spelling it out. Behind those phrases were real fears. Fears of miscalculation, of escalation, of a move that couldn't be undone once made. China's silence, meanwhile, became its own form of pressure. The absence of denial allowed speculation to thrive. The absence of confirmation kept options open. Every day without clarity increased the sense that the truth, when it emerged, would be disruptive. And yet, nothing emerged. Just more waiting. Another angle, quietly developing, was the regional response. Neighboring countries watched closely, aware that instability in Venezuela rarely stays contained. Migration flows, energy markets, political alliances, all could be affected. Some governments called for calm. Others stayed silent, not wanting to be pulled into a conflict that wasn't theirs. But even silence was a choice, and everyone knew it. For Maduro's supporters, the narrative was framed as resistance. They spoke of sovereignty, of standing up to pressure, of choosing partners freely. For critics, it looked like desperation, a last-minute move to secure protection before accountability arrived. Both narratives existed at the same time, colliding in public discourse and deepening divisions within and outside the country. As intelligence agencies continued their work, the focus shifted slightly from what had been moved to what might come next. Would there be more transfers? More quiet deals? Or would the exposure itself force a change in strategy? In chess, sometimes revealing a move changes the entire game. Even if the piece hasn't landed yet, the most unsettling part was how normal everything looked on the surface. Planes still took off. Ships still crossed oceans. Leaders still smiled for photos. And yet, beneath that normalcy, trust was eroding. The assumption that major actions would be visible, predictable, and negotiable no longer held. The idea that something this large could move quietly had shaken confidence in existing safeguards. For ordinary people watching from afar, the story felt distant but heavy. They sensed that this wasn't just another headline that would fade in a few days. It had layers, and those layers were still being uncovered. Every update hinted at more beneath the surface, more connections, more consequences waiting to unfold, and so the tension held. No confrontation, no resolution, no clear truth, just a growing awareness that the world had shifted slightly off balance. Somewhere, the full story existed, intact and hidden, known to only a few. The rest of the world was left piecing together shadows, knowing that when the next piece finally emerged, it could change everything. As the pressure mounted, the feeling that something was about to break became impossible to ignore. The pauses between updates grew heavier than the updates themselves. Every delay felt intentional, every silence loaded with meaning. It was no longer a question of whether the story would escalate, but when and who would make the first unmistakable move. In Washington, the language quietly shifted. Officials stopped talking only about Venezuela and started speaking more openly about global stability and strategic thresholds. Those words signaled that the issue had crossed into a wider frame. This was no longer just a regional concern or a bilateral dispute. It was being treated as a test of influence, credibility, and control. And tests like that rarely stay theoretical for long. Behind the scenes, contingency planning intensified. Scenarios were drafted and read. Analysts debated timelines, triggers, and consequences. What if more assets were moved? What if confirmation suddenly surfaced? What if a leak forced someone's hand? Each question carried weight, and none had comfortable answers. The sense of urgency didn't come from panic, but from the fear of being unprepared. In Beijing, the mood grew more serious. The careful calm remained, but attention sharpened. Diplomatic channels stayed open, even as messages became firmer. There was an understanding that perception mattered almost as much as reality. If China appeared passive, it risked emboldening pressure. If it appeared too assertive, it risked escalation. Walking that line required precision, and precision demanded time that felt increasingly scarce. Caracas, meanwhile, felt like a city holding its breath. The government continued its routine appearances, but something in the tone had changed. Speeches were shorter, statements were more defensive. Loyalists spoke with rehearsed confidence, while critics sensed an opportunity but didn't yet know how to act on it. Everyone seemed to be waiting for a signal, some sign that would tell them which direction the wind was about to blow. One of the most unsettling developments was the rise in quiet warnings from unexpected places. Former diplomats, retired officials, people who rarely spoke publicly began hinting that the situation was more fragile than it appeared. They didn't offer proof. They didn't name sources, but they spoke with the kind of restraint that suggested first-hand knowledge, enough to unsettle, not enough to clarify. The mystery of the 300-ton transfer loomed larger than ever. With no confirmation, it became a symbol of secrecy, of leverage, of a world where the most important moves happen out of sight. The exact nature of the shipment almost seemed secondary now. What mattered was what it represented: a shift in trust, a challenge to norms, a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. As international media intensified coverage, every frame of video, every background detail was scrutinized. A cargo ship leaving a port, a diplomatic plane landing at an unusual hour, a meeting scheduled, then abruptly canceled. None of it proved anything on its own, but together they created a sense of motion, as if events were quietly accelerating toward a point of no return. Another layer of tension came from the financial world. Signals there tend to appear before political decisions do. Currency fluctuations, sudden hedging, cautious moves by investors. These were subtle signs that confidence was thinning. The markets weren't panicking, but they were bracing, and that alone spoke volumes. Money reacts to risk even when governments refuse to name it. Inside Venezuela, the human cost of uncertainty deepened. Families delayed decisions, businesses postponed plans. People saved what little they could, just in case. For them, the idea of a strategic crisis wasn't abstract. It was felt in the pauses, in the rumors, in the sense that the future had become harder to imagine clearly. They didn't know what the transfer meant, but they knew it mattered. Internationally, allies of both the United States and China began quietly asking questions. Where do we stand if this escalates? What commitments are implied? What risks are acceptable? These weren't questions meant for public discussion, but they shaped the background of every official interaction. Even countries far from Venezuela felt the ripple effects. Aware that global power struggles rarely stay contained, the most dangerous aspect of the moment was misunderstanding. With so much information classified or withheld, assumptions filled the gaps. And assumptions, once embedded, are hard to reverse. A move meant as defense could be read as provocation. Silence could be read as defiance. In that environment, the margin for error shrank dramatically. As days turned into weeks, the story reached a strange point where tension became normalized. People adjusted to the uncertainty, even as it grew sharper. That normalization was deceptive. History shows that the calmest moments often come just before decisive turns. The absence of action didn't mean safety, it meant anticipation. Somewhere, decisions were being finalized. Orders prepared but not yet given. Statements drafted but not yet released. The sense that events were aligning, quietly and deliberately, became harder to shake. Whatever the truth behind the transfer, it had set forces in motion that could not simply be paused or reversed. And so the world waited, aware that the next development might not come with warning. It could arrive as a leak, a confirmation, a sudden shift in tone, or a move that spoke louder than words. The pieces were on the board. The players were watching each other closely. And the question hanging over everything was no longer what had already happened, but what would happen when someone finally decided the waiting had gone on long enough. Just as the world settled into that uneasy wait, a new detail surfaced quietly at first, then spreading fast enough to change the tone of everything. It didn't come from an official announcement or a press conference. It came from a leak, not a full document, not a clear confession, but enough fragments to suggest that the alleged 300-ton transfer may not have been a single shipment at all. It may have been part of something larger, staged over time, hidden in plain sight according to people familiar with the matter. Analysts began revisiting older data, shipping records, diplomatic movements, financial signals that once seemed routine. Patterns emerged that hadn't stood out before. Smaller transfers, spread across weeks, movements that individually looked harmless, but together told a different story. If true, it meant the operation wasn't rushed or desperate. It was planned, and that possibility sent a chill through every capital watching. For Washington, this changed the calculation. A one-time move could be explained as panic. A phased strategy suggested intent. It raised the uncomfortable idea that Venezuela, under Maduro's leadership, may have been quietly preparing for this moment, long before the world noticed. If assets had been moving gradually toward China, then the strategic crisis wasn't sudden, it had simply reached visibility. The reaction inside U.S. policy circles grew sharper. Conversations turned from if to how much. How much had already been transferred, how much remained, and how much leverage had already slipped out of reach. The concern was no longer just about stopping something, it was about understanding what had already been lost. In Beijing, the shift was just as noticeable. The calm messaging remained, but diplomatic activity increased. Meetings multiplied. Phone calls stretched late into the night. The silence that once felt neutral now felt deliberate. If China had anticipated exposure, then staying quiet wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. And that realization made others uneasy. Back in Caracas, the mood hardened. Officials denied everything with greater intensity, insisting that rumors were being weaponized to justify foreign pressure. Yet the denials grew more emotional, less measured. To outside observers, it felt like a sign of strain. To supporters, it sounded like defiance. Either way, the sense that something was slipping out of control became harder to dismiss. Another unexpected angle emerged. When regional voices began to speak up, not governments, but insiders, former advisors, economists, people once close enough to know how decisions were made. They described a leadership obsessed with survival, convinced that time was against it, willing to trade long-term influence for short-term security. Whether those claims were true or not, they fit too neatly into the unfolding narrative to ignore. The idea that the transfer involved more than material value also began circulating. What if it wasn't just about weight or wealth? What if it included agreements, guarantees, or commitments that couldn't be measured in tons? Strategic access, long-term concessions, quiet promises made when options were few. Those possibilities raised the stakes far beyond economics and into the realm of geopolitical alignment. For ordinary Venezuelans, these revelations felt distant yet deeply personal. They didn't see documents or data, but they felt the consequences. Prices crept upward. Uncertainty crept inward. People asked each other the same question in different ways. What does this mean for us? No one had an answer. The United States and China now seemed locked in a careful stare, each aware that misreading the other could make things worse. Publicly, restraint was emphasized. Privately, patience wore thin. The strategic crisis label began to feel less like a warning, and more like a description of reality. What made the moment truly dangerous was how quickly the story was evolving. Each new hint reframed the last. Each unanswered question made the next one heavier. The original mystery of the 300-ton transfer had expanded into something more complex, a web of decisions, signals and silent understandings stretching across borders. As analysts raced to connect the dots, one unsettling thought gained traction. If this was only the second layer of the story, how many more remained hidden? And if exposure itself was accelerating events, then every new revelation wasn't slowing the crisis, it was pushing it forward. By now, the sense of inevitability was hard to escape. Something had been set in motion long before the world noticed. The pieces were no longer just moving, they were converging, and whatever came next wouldn't arrive quietly. It would arrive as a moment, one that would force choices, reveal intentions, and bring the long-building tension to its breaking point. The only thing still uncertain was who would act first, and whether, when that moment came, anyone would still be able to control what followed. The breaking point didn't come with sirens or speeches. It came with confirmation. A carefully worded statement released almost simultaneously in Washington and Beijing acknowledged what had been avoided for weeks. Assets of significant value linked to Venezuela had been transferred abroad under diplomatic protection, No numbers were repeated publicly. No inventory was listed, but the implication was clear. The 300-ton question was no longer speculation. It was real. In Washington, the strategic crisis was formally elevated. Officials framed it as a challenge to global norms, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and balance of power. Behind that language was relief mixed with frustration. Relief that the uncertainty had ended. Frustration that the move had already happened. The focus shifted quickly from prevention to response. What leverage remained? What agreements were now in question? And how much of Venezuela's future had already been decided without its people? China's response followed a different tone. Calm, measured, almost restrained. The statement emphasized legality, partnership, and long-standing cooperation. It avoided specifics, but it didn't retreat. For observers, that was the clearest signal yet. Beijing wasn't surprised by the exposure. It had prepared for it. Whatever had arrived was now part of a larger calculation. One China was willing to stand by. In Caracas, the moment hit hardest. The government confirmed the transfer in principle while rejecting accusations of wrongdoing. Officials described it as a sovereign decision, a protective measure taken under extreme pressure. For some supporters, it felt like vindication, proof that the leadership had outmaneuvered its opponents. For critics, it was confirmation of their worst fears, that national wealth and leverage had been quietly moved beyond reach. The human reaction was immediate and raw. People didn't argue about geopolitics. They argued about consequences. Would this bring stability or more isolation? Would it secure support or invite retaliation? Conversations filled with equal parts anger and exhaustion. The mystery was solved, but the cost was only beginning to show. Then came the unexpected twist. As analysts examined the confirmed details more closely, a new reality emerged. The transfer, while massive, was not what most had assumed. It wasn't the core of Venezuela's reserves. It wasn't the final safeguard. It was a decoy, a powerful one, but still a decoy. The real shift had happened elsewhere, quietly and legally, months earlier. Through restructuring agreements and future commitments that barely made headlines at the time, the 300 tons had drawn attention, absorbed pressure, and triggered the crisis. But the deeper change was already locked in through long-term energy contracts, infrastructure control, and repayment structures that extended far beyond any single shipment. By the time the world focused on the cargo, the real leverage had already changed hands. That realization stunned observers. The crisis everyone had been watching was only part of the picture. The visible move had masked a slower, more permanent transition of influence. Venezuela hadn't just moved assets. It had moved alignment. In Washington, the mood shifted again, this time toward sober acceptance. The confrontation they had prepared for wasn't the one that mattered most. The strategic landscape had already changed, not through confrontation, but through patience and timing. The lesson was uncomfortable. Power doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it settles quietly, while attention is elsewhere. China, for its part, said nothing new. It didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. The partnership it had built was no longer theoretical. It was embedded, contractual, and difficult to reverse without significant cost. The crisis had passed its peak, but its effects would linger. And Venezuela? It stood at a crossroads shaped by choices made under pressure. The leadership had gained breathing room, but at a price that would be paid over years, not weeks. The people were left to wonder whether this path would bring relief or simply trade one form of dependence for another. As the dust settled, one final question remained, the one no statement addressed. If this transfer was a distraction, and the real shift had already occurred, then what other changes were unfolding quietly, beyond the spotlight? In a world where power moves in layers, the end of one crisis may only mark the beginning of the next. When the noise finally began to fade, what remained was a quieter kind of reckoning. The headlines moved on, the urgent alerts stopped flashing, and the world's attention slowly shifted to the next breaking story. But for the people and governments involved, nothing truly snapped back to normal. The crisis had passed its peak, yet its imprint was everywhere, in policy papers, in cautious diplomatic language, and in the private calculations of leaders who now understood that the ground beneath them had shifted. In Washington, the focus turned inward. Officials reviewed timelines, decisions, and assumptions that had shaped their response. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. The transfer had not changed the balance overnight, but it had exposed how much the balance had already changed. Sanctions, pressure, and public warnings had limits. Influence could be redirected quietly, through patience and planning, long before it became visible enough to confront. That realization reshaped future strategy, even if it was never admitted openly. China approached the aftermath